Wessel Reijers, doctor y postdoctor de la Universidad de Dublín, investigador asociado de la European University de Florencia, Italia, y experto en filosofía y ética de la tecnología, considera que estamos viviendo en la era del informacionismo, un fenómeno que en términos del procesamiento de la información, la cualificación de la civilidad y la formación de la ciudadanía está ejerciendo un gran efecto en la identidad de las comunidades de la nube cibernética y en el modo como se gobierna la sociedad occidental. El análisis hermenéutico crítico de la tecnología de la gobernanza para la ciudadanía global contempla el concepto de matriz humana, un concepto que denomina un estado de cosas que han resultado de varios eventos del cambio social, propiciado por la revolución industrial, a partir de la cual se instituyeron el trabajo masivo, la jerarquía de roles y la medición social como insumos para el ejercicio del poder por parte de los gobiernos y los sistemas técnico-sociales.
It's an honor to speak to you today on the topic of the metrification of good citizenship. It's very unfortunate that I can't be there to see you in person in Colombia due to the COVID situation, but luckily this is the best or the second best alternative to speak to you through video. First, a little bit about me. I'm a research associate at the European University Institute in Florence. My expertise lies with the philosophy and ethics of technology, and I have written a book recently called Narrative and Technology Ethics together with Mark Kuckelberg, and as well I have co-edited a volume called Interpreting Technology, which combines the thinking of Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher, with our thinking about technology. But today I want to focus on the topic of human metrics. And in order to do so, first I will give a brief introduction and introduce you to the question of how do human metrics shape good citizenship. Subsequently, I will present a brief history of how human metrics have been used in governance. Then I will go to today and I will present how human metrics are used in governance through socio-technical systems, both in China and in the Western world. And finally, I will reflect on how this use of human metrics in governance reshapes our understanding of citizenship and of civic virtue. But first, to contextualize the topic, we live today in what is called the age of dataism, which means that data processing has an increasingly important effect on our daily lives. And this also has an effect in the way in which we govern society, which can be illustrated by different ways. First, when we look at the judiciary branch, artificial intelligence and big data are being used to create artificial judges who can judge criminals based on, for example, the risk that they will commit the same crime again. On the other hand, there are also innovations in the realm of distributed systems, blockchain technology, that transform the way that we can govern communities and in that sense affect a legislative branch of government, or potentially affect it. And finally, in terms of the executive branch, we see that governments and administrations are increasingly using automated processes in administrative issues, for example, in taxation, and to create, so to say, citizen risk scores. What this trend shows is that there is something that is like politics of technology. In the last years, there have been a lot of discussions about what is called like ethics of technology, ethics of AI, which focus more on the kind of individual ethical impact of technologies. But what has been neglected to some extent is the political impact of technologies, and which was already foreshadowed actually in the 1980s by a paper of Langdon Winner, who talked about the politics in artifacts. So in this context, I would like to frame the discussion of today. And this discussion is about what I call human metrics. And what can we understand with human metrics? To give a brief and broad characterization, these are systems for measurement and quantitative assessment, which includes rating, ranking, and scoring. But in this case, it's particularly about these processes with regards to humans, so scoring humans and human qualities. And to contextualize this, I look at this as a means for governance, which is increasingly prevalent today. And actually, we see this in our everyday lives. Whenever we, for example, take an Uber ride, or when we go to university and we have to rate our professors, or even when we go on a dating market, rating and scoring are part and parcel of our everyday lives these days. But before we look into how human metrics are shaped today, I would like to present a brief history of human metrics, looking at their religious roots, their secularization through the Enlightenment, and also the way in which technology gave human metrics kind of hand and feet in the course of the Industrial Revolution. When we look at human metrics historically speaking, we can see that actually their roots lie in religious practices. And these religious practices can be characterized as moral bookkeeping. And in order to illustrate this, we can go to China. China in the 16th and 17th century, in which there was a new popular practice of which is called keeping ledgers of merit and demerit. And this goes back to religious practices that go back like for millennia in Buddhism and Taoism. And the principle was basically like that people were keeping a sort of diary in which they kept track of their good deeds and their sins in order to calculate, so to say, a moral score in light of their spiritual deservedness in the hereafter, in the supernatural realm. So this was a practice in China, but in fact in Europe we can see similar practices. In the Middle Ages, for example, the Catholic Church developed practices of indulgence and confession, which revolved around kind of the same principle. And interestingly, in Renaissance Italy, these practices of confession were kind of transposed from the religious realm to the realm of the market, especially through the invention of the double entry bookkeeping technique. And this can be understood in the following way, that this meticulous keeping of good deeds and sins had kind of its equivalence in meticulous keeping of the books of one's income and one's outcome, one's costs. And scholars like James Aho kind of therefore argue that for the Renaissance merchants, keeping the books accurately was a way of signaling one's virtue, in a similar way as keeping one's good deeds and one's sins was a way to signal one's virtue towards the hereafter. But what's interesting in this process is that, in a way, this moral bookkeeping is then brought from the heavens down to earth through this practice of double entry bookkeeping. And we see that in the Enlightenment, philosophy actually followed this, especially in the context of utilitarianism. So according to the utilitarian doctrine, which was first pronounced by people like Francis Hutchinson, this idea of human metrics is not actually a divine process where the supernatural realm is scoring a human being, but rather it's a psychological process. So this notion of human metrics is brought from the heavens kind of down into the human psyche. And here arises for the first time this notion of a moral calculus, that there are certain psychological principles that can be measured and calculated in order to measure someone's morality. However, of course, especially at the time, people could not really look into the skull, into one's psyche to see these principles. And that's why, according to utilitarianism, there's an important proxy, and the proxy is action. So what this means is that actually, where one wanted to measure a person's virtue, in the end, the measurement was not a virtue, but it was a measure of public costs and benefits. So the kind of early idea of a risk-benefit analysis. And this moral calculus, this what underlies modern utilitarianism, has influenced many different fields in society: psychology, sociology, and biology. However, in the Enlightenment, this idea of human metrics was actually still an idea. It was not yet made practical. So only in the Industrial Revolution, with what I call the birth of the industrial organism, for example, the factory, we see that human metrics, so these systems of measurement, are giving basically tangible hands and feet. Or maybe better said, because we can think of it as an organism, they got eyes, a brain, and hands. So let me explain this briefly. With regards to the eyes, we see that in the Industrial Revolution, there has been a proliferation of development of universal standards and metrics. For example, people were given surnames, which made it much easier to collect data on them, and for states and organizations to actually see their subjects, see their citizens, see their workers. Secondly, in this period, one could say there was also the development of an industrial brain. And this development can be understood in the context of the early development of statistics, which at the outset was the application of mathematical probabilistic methods that came from the natural sciences, from astronomy, to actually data that came from society, data about populations. And this early development of statistics made that quantification could lead to the prediction of social processes. And finally, also in the Industrial Revolution, one could say that human metrics got, so to say, hands to affect their impact on the world. These hands have been, for example, blacklists that have helped in excluding people from certain professions, for example, but also the development of credit scores that follow us all the way to today, and of loyalty schemes for companies to bind customers, for example, to their businesses. So we see that in this period, the tangible tools and techniques and technologies have been developed that power the human metrics that we have today. Let us now move from the history of human metrics to human metrics as they are being used today in governance. And here I would like to focus on the social credit system as it has been developed in China, similar systems as they are being used in liberal democracies, but also looking at their similarities and differences. Since 2014, with the publication of the State Council Agenda, China has been developing the so-called social credit system. This system revolves primarily around red lists and blacklists that are being kept by state institutions and agencies. Red lists mean that people have behaved well, therefore they can get some rewards. Blacklists mean that they have behaved badly or did illegal things and therefore can expect punishment. The social credit system integrates these red lists and blacklists in an ecosystem in which data are being shared by different agencies, and also that is being governed by a so-called joint punishment or joint sanction system. The principle here is that an infraction in one part of one's public life can lead to punishments as a trickle-down effect in many different other parts. So if you get on a blacklist somewhere, infamously, you can, for example, be restricted in flying with domestic flight or taking domestic flights within China. The social credit system is developed at the national level, but at the same time, there have been also local pilots with different forms of social credit systems. And in these local pilots use human metrics even more expressively. So here there are really examples of where there are catalogs of good and bad deeds where people have a point score. So you can start out with 1,000 points and then you can win or lose points based on whether you are behaving good or badly. And many of these systems use technology, so data-driven and sensing technologies, in order to produce these scores or to hand out rewards and punishments. There are also commercial initiatives in China that are closely related to the social credit system. Maybe most famously, there is this system called Sesame Credit that was developed by Alibaba. And these systems of credit scoring or social credit scoring that are being developed by commercial parties make more use even of similar systems that we know from big tech giants in the West, for example, Google and Facebook. So they use big data analysis of consumer data in order to produce these scores. And the different commercial initiatives in China are at this moment actually being consolidated towards one credit rating agency or social credit rating agency, which is called Beihang Credit. So we can see that this kind of represents a vast project that includes human metrics in the governance of society. However, this doesn't only happen in the Chinese context. Actually, in liberal democracies, we can see similar systems having an increasingly powerful role in the governance of society. At the private level, we can see that sharing economy giants like Airbnb and Uber increasingly make use of scores of customers or service providers. But also, there are very influential credit scoring systems like FICO in the United States and Schufa in Germany. At the public level, there are many different scoring and rating systems that operate in order to govern public agencies. For example, there are countries that have personal scores for performance in the military. But there are also public agencies that keep, for example, airport blacklists in order to let some travelers travel easy, but also to keep some travelers from traveling. And also at the municipal level, there are experiments that are very reminiscent of what is happening at the moment in China with the social credit system. An interesting example is the Portuguese city of Cascais that has implemented a system called Innovate City Points, where citizens actually can keep track of their good deeds for their community, for their local community, in order to reap some rewards from the municipality. So we can see that there's actually quite some overlap between the social credit system and the use of human metrics in the system in China and similar systems in liberal democracies. However, there are also some important differences that I would like to discuss. First, there is the difference in scope. So China and the social credit system is the first of its kind with regards to the scope that it covers the entire society potentially. So instead of it rating or scoring different people with different professions or in different roles, they score citizens qua citizens. And that therefore it kind of touches upon the category of citizenship. Second of all, there's a difference in authority between these different types of systems. Whereas in the liberal democracies, most of these systems are being curated and owned by private actors. In the Chinese case, the entire enterprise is government sponsored, including actually these commercial initiatives where the government has an important say in how they're being developed. And finally, there's also a difference in regime type, whereas systems in liberal democracies are embedded within a liberal democratic context. The Chinese social credit system is developed and implemented within an authoritarian context. In this final part of my presentation, I would like to go back to the central question, namely, how do human metrics shape citizenship? We can understand citizenship according to different dimensions of status, identity, and participation. And in this context, human metrics raise a whole range and variety of issues which have to do with the rule of law, governance, privacy, due process, etc. I will now focus on its impact on civic virtue. And the reason for this is that projects like the social credit system in China focus on the use of human metrics to raise civic morality or civic virtue quite primarily. My argument will be that the use of human metrics for citizenship governance poses a threat of domination, conformism, and depoliticization. In order to make this argument, I look at different models of civic virtue in political philosophy. And these different models, they answer certain questions about civic virtue. For example, they look at what civic virtue is, how it is being cultivated, what type of architectures and infrastructures exist in society to make it work, and how citizens are motivated to act virtuously. When we look at the social credit system, we can draw certain conclusions about what kind of model of civic virtue is being offered. And overall, this model is highly instrumentalized and standardized. The reasons for this are threefold. First of all, civic virtue in the social credit system is motivated through external goods like reputation and sanction. So that's kind of an instrumental motivation to cultivate civic virtue. Second of all, civic virtue is cultivated through a mode of instruction based on pre-given catalogs of good and bad behavior, which already presuppose certain standards about good and bad behavior. So it's kind of it standardizes this notion of civic virtue. And finally, it also enforces the cultivation of civic virtue through a centralized, technology-driven architecture. And we can criticize all these three aspects of the social credit system through the light or through the lens of political philosophy. First of all, with regards to a centralized architecture, we can look at new Republican theories, for example, developed by people like Philip Pettit. According to these theories, civic virtue has to be understood as a sense of civility, which enables people to cooperate in society. Under these headings, actually civic virtue is quite instrumental. It's instrumental for cooperation in society. And it can also be instructed by peer-to-peer interactions. However, New Republicans are strongly against the idea that there can be a central authority or explicit rules that would dictate how civic virtue is to be cultivated. They insist that there is something called an intangible hand that depends on the decentralized networks of peer-to-peer interactions that would cultivate civic virtue. A centralized form would actually, according to this view, pose a threat of domination. Secondly, we can criticize the sanction and reward system of the use of human metrics like in the social credit system. So to say, this use of technological carrots and sticks. Here we can look at civic humanists like Aristotle or McIntyre. According to them, civic virtue is a form of excellence. And we have to distinguish between two types of civic virtue in society. On the one hand, effectiveness, and on the other hand, excellence. Effectiveness is the case when citizens are being ruled by a government, for example. And it's important because we want citizens to be effective in, for example, paying taxes. However, the second notion of civic virtue as excellence only happens when citizens get the opportunity to co-rule, to participate in governance. And in this context, it can only be the case if they are motivated to participate in governance by aiming at goods that are internal to the practices of governance, which means they have to be intrinsically motivated. And this goes against the system that is presented by the social credit system, where there is no intrinsic motivation, but extrinsic motivation through external goods that are being offered of, for example, reward and punishment. And this then creates a certain threat of conformism within a system of citizenship and the cultivation of civic virtue. And finally, we can also target the way in which civic virtue is instructed or cultivated in the social credit system. As we've seen, this is a mode of instruction where standards of civic virtue are based on past norms and rules that are laid out in these catalogs of good and bad behavior. And this doesn't square with the notion of civic virtue as it is being promoted by existential Republicans, we could say, like Hannah Arendt. These scholars argue that civic virtue can only be cultivated through a form of anticipatory action, of taking initiative in the public sphere. And this type of cultivation of civic virtue cannot be predetermined. It cannot be based on past standards or standards that have been determined in the past in order to evaluate behavior. And this is the case because, and by keeping this notion of anticipatory action as a way of cultivating civic virtue, according to scholars like Hannah Arendt, we maintain a public sphere of appearances like the Greek agora in which political action can happen. Systems that go against this, like the social credit system, pose a certain threat, therefore, of depoliticization, the kind of continuous degradation of political action in society. So we see that actually human metrics in citizenship governance poses quite a threat to the way that civic virtue is being shaped in our societies. But what then can be a responsible way to implement human metrics within the governance of citizenship? When we look at these three models of civic virtue. Well, when it comes to civility, we can say that actually, as long as there is a decentralized, emergent network of norms, we can facilitate civility. So we do not want to have a centralized architecture that, or technologically driven architecture that cultivates civic virtue, but we can think of decentralized systems that might actually manage to do the same thing. When it comes to this notion of excellence, so partaking in governance, we can focus on finding ways to bend this notion of extrinsic motivation through reputation gains and punishment, for example, to intrinsic motivation. Channeling, for example, the crowding out effect that we find in the literature. And finally, when it comes to political action, this notion of anticipatory action, we can see that there is actually a realm of human activity that we want to keep free from any interference of human metrics, and namely this realm of political action. So there we have to set certain boundaries within which human metrics should not be used. So what this normative assessment shows is that there's quite something at stake when we look at the future of citizenship and the use of human metrics. And the way that we shape the governance of human metrics in the next decades will also determine whether we will live in a future utopia or dystopia in that sense. And with that, I would like to conclude this presentation, and thank you very much for being with me throughout these thoughts.
Matriz humana es un sistema de manejo y evaluación cuantitativa de las personas y de sus cualidades como seres humanos que incluye mediciones de sintonía, rating, clasificación, ranking y puntaje, scoring. Desde esta perspectiva, la matriz humana sería un medio para la gobernanza. Las raíces históricas de este fenómeno están en la prevalencia de la religión, en la posterior secularización de diversos estamentos sociales y como consecuencia de la revolución industrial en la tecnocracia que vivimos en el presente. En conjunto, matriz humana es un juego de moralidad y un ejercicio de poder, un concepto que invita a preguntarse sobre cuál debería ser la política sobre la tecnología y en esta misma línea, cuál debería ser la mirada que hay que tener acerca del impacto político de la tecnología en los individuos.